The rain came down like a hymn no church had ever dared to sing, soft at first, then steady, then wild, swallowing the dirt road that led through the black pines. It was the kind of night that made even the wind sound lonely. James Calder had long grown used to such nights, the ones where a man's only company was the groan of his own roof and the whisper of the storm around him. He sat by the fire, coat still damp from mending the far fence earlier, when the soft, uneven crunch of footsteps outside caught his ear. He rose slowly, as men who live alone often do, as though each movement carried its own weight. The wind pushed against the door when he opened it, bringing in the cold breath of the storm. And there she was. A young woman stood on the porch, rain clinging to her like sorrow she couldn't shed. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to a body worn thin, her dark hair plastered to her cheek. One hand cradled the swell of her belly beneath the fabric, the other hung limp at her side. Her lips trembled, not from cold alone but from something heavier, something that lived deeper. "I ain't worth much, sir," she whispered, eyes fixed on the ground as though she didn't deserve the light spilling from his doorway. James didn't speak right away. He simply stepped forward, into the rain, letting it soak his shirt. His coat came off his shoulders with a practiced motion, heavy and smelling faintly of cedar smoke and earth. He draped it over her like one might cover a wound that's too tender to name. She flinched at the gesture, not in fear of him but from the unfamiliar warmth of it. "Come inside," he said softly. She didn't move at first. Rainwater dripped from her hair onto the wooden boards, gathering in small puddles at her feet. When she finally crossed the threshold, she did it as if the house might reject her too. James closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The fire flickered low in the hearth, shadows moving like silent witnesses along the cabin walls. She stood near the door, shivering beneath his coat, unsure whether to sit or keep standing. James moved without sound, setting a pot back over the coals, ladling warm stew into a tin bowl. He placed it on the table, then stepped aside, giving her space. She hesitated before sitting. Her hands shook as she wrapped them around the warm metal, as if holding heat for the first time in years. She didn't thank him. People who've known too much cold forget how to shape gratitude on their tongues. He returned to his chair near the fire, his gaze steady but never prying. Her eyes wandered over the rough wooden room, the rifle hanging on the far wall, the half-sawn plank still resting on the workbench, the old rocking chair near the window. It wasn't a rich man's cabin, but it was clean and quiet and dry. "You walked through that storm?" he asked. Her jaw tightened. "Didn't have nowhere else." Her accent was soft, the kind born from the edge of faraway farms. The kind that carried too many goodbyes inside it. She didn't explain more, and he didn't ask. Some stories are too raw to touch on the first night. As she ate, the silence between them grew, not sharp or cold, but thick like something sturdy enough to rest against. He poured a cup of water and set it near her. She nodded once in thanks, not looking up. When her hands stopped trembling, she whispered her name. "Alma." James gave a small nod. No questions. Just that. The storm outside pressed harder, rain hammering against the windows like 1,000 impatient hands. She drew the coat tighter around herself, closing her eyes for a moment, as if trying to remember what safety felt like. Beneath the worn wool, her belly rose gently with each breath, a quiet, living thing she carried alone. "Spare bed's over there," he said after a while, pointing to the cot near the corner. "You can sleep." She looked at the cot, then at him, the old habit of suspicion flickering in her eyes like a dying flame. Too many nights had taught her what kindness sometimes cost. But there was no demand in his voice, no threat tucked into the corners of his words. Just a quiet offering, like a hand extended without wanting anything back. Alma moved slowly, sitting at the edge of the cot, boots leaving a trail of mud across the floorboards. She winced as she lay down, hand over her belly as if to shield it from the world. Her breath came uneven at first, then steadied. James sat back in his chair, listening to the fire breathe. He had lived too long on the quiet side of the world to miss what her silence was saying. It was the silence of someone who'd been thrown out before she had a chance to stand. Someone who'd learned to make herself small, hoping no one would notice her enough to hurt her again. She didn't know that he, too, carried silences of his own, the kind carved by years of watching good things drift away. He didn't speak it. He just kept the fire fed, letting its warmth reach her where words could not. A sudden gust shook the cabin, rattling the window panes. Alma's hand gripped the edge of the blanket, her body tense. James rose, checking the latch on the door, his movements calm and certain. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, something soft and uncertain flickering in her chest. When he returned to his chair, he didn't speak again. The rain softened, no longer raging, just falling like a steady drumbeat. Alma's breathing slowed, her lashes damp from the storm. For the first time in months, perhaps longer, she wasn't out in the cold. James leaned back slightly, eyes on the fire. The storm had brought a stranger to his door, but not just any stranger. A woman carrying a story he didn't yet know. A woman carrying a child into a world that hadn't been kind to her. He didn't need to know the rest tonight. The walls of the cabin were steady. The fire would hold until morning. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines like a weary traveler finally sitting down. Inside, her breathing grew soft. The night closed around them, quiet and wet and strangely gentle. James didn't touch the silence. He let it live between them, like a fragile thing that might one day grow strong enough to hold its own. The rain had brought her here. It was enough for now. Spring drifted slowly into the valley, as if the land itself were waking from a long, hard prayer. The storm that had carried Alma to James Calder's door months ago now returned only in whispers, soft breezes, damp earth, the quiet groan of the pines stretching in the sun. But for all the tenderness of the season, something in the air carried a tension neither of them could name. The world beyond the cabin was watching. Alma knelt in the small garden behind the house, fingers sunk into damp soil, the scent of earth filling her lungs. The baby inside her shifted, a quiet reminder that life kept moving even when the world tried to make her stop. James had built a low fence around the garden, careful and sturdy, like everything he touched. When she first arrived, she could barely meet his eyes. Now, she traced the lines of the wooden beams with a kind of reverence, not for the wood itself but for what it meant. Shelter. Safety. A place that did not ask her to vanish. James was fixing a section of the porch rail, sleeves rolled up to the elbows, sweat darkening the fabric of his shirt. He worked with quiet precision, as he always did, letting the sounds of the hammer fill the spaces their voices rarely touched. They didn't talk much, neither had ever needed words to know how to live. But a glance passed between them now and then, quick as a flicker, enough to say everything the mouth didn't know how to shape. Alma tied her hair back, hands streaked with soil, when she noticed the dust cloud rising on the road beyond the tree line. A wagon. Her fingers stiffened around the spade. James noticed her stillness before he saw the cause. He straightened slowly, gaze narrowing at the shape rolling closer. She didn't need to ask who it might be. The town had been whispering for weeks, soft at first, then louder, the way weeds grow without asking permission. The widow, heavy with child, living with a man alone in the woods. Some called it improper. Some called it shameful. But gossip never needed to be true to do its work. It only needed to find ears. The wagon stopped near the gate. Hiram Dole climbed down, slick as an oil stain, hat crooked, eyes too sharp. Two other men sat behind him, faces tight with judgment they wore like fine clothes. Alma's heart pressed hard against her ribs. James stepped down from the porch with the quiet ease of a man who didn't bend to other people's noise. Hiram spat into the dirt before speaking, his smile thin and cold. "Afternoon, Calder. Ain't it something, the things a man does when no one's lookin'?" James said nothing. He rested one hand on the porch post, posture loose but unreadable. Hiram's eyes slid toward Alma, slow and unkind. "Folks in town been talkin'. Ain't hard to see why. A woman like that, round as she is, livin' under your roof, don't seem proper. Folks don't take kindly to that sort of business. Alma's shoulders tightened. She wanted to shrink the way she'd done all her life when the world decided her worth for her. Her fingers dug into her skirt as if the fabric might anchor her. James took one quiet step forward, not toward them, but between them and her. "She's not your business," he said evenly. Hiram's laugh was thin and mean. "When a woman like that goes about layin' her shame at decent men's doors, it becomes everyone's business." The wind picked up, carrying the edge of spring chill through the pines. For a heartbeat no one spoke. James's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm, low like a steady river. "You'd best get off my land." Hiram shifted, sensing something in James's tone that wasn't a threat but something heavier, quieter. He tipped his hat, smirking. "Rain's comin' again. You'll see, Calder. Folks don't forget." He climbed back onto the wagon, dust curling behind them as they left the way they came. When the sound of hooves faded, Alma finally let out the breath she'd been holding. Her body was rigid, like a deer waiting for the snap of a twig that never came. James turned toward her, meeting her eyes with a softness that didn't need to be spoken. She looked down, ashamed not of what she'd done but of how easily the world could make her feel small. He didn't reach for her. He didn't tell her not to worry. He simply stood there, steady, the kind of presence that said, "I will not let the world break you again." Later that evening, the wind shifted. Dark clouds moved across the sky, the first drops of rain tapping against the roof like the memory of a night they'd both carried quietly. Alma sat on the porch, wrapped in James's old coat, watching the pines sway. The rain darkened the soil in the garden, blurred the horizon until everything felt held in the same breath. James stepped outside, lantern in hand, the warm glow lighting the angles of his face. He stopped near her but didn't sit right away. She was tired, though she wouldn't say it. The baby pressed against her ribs, a steady rhythm beneath her skin. "I didn't ask for you to fight them," she said softly. He leaned against the railing, eyes on the rain, not her. "I didn't fight them." A quiet pause. "I just didn't let them take something that wasn't theirs." She turned toward him then, really seeing him, the way a soul sees another when everything else has been stripped away. It was the same quiet she had felt that first night in the storm, but now it wasn't fear wrapped around her heart. It was something steadier. The rain fell harder, sliding down the porch steps in silver ribbons. James finally sat beside her, the lantern between them. They didn't touch. They didn't have to. The space between their shoulders carried a weight softer than any embrace. She whispered, "You could have let me go when they came." His eyes stayed on the horizon, rain blurring the treeline. "You ain't goin' nowhere." Something in his voice settled in her chest like a warm hand. She didn't have a name for it yet. She didn't need one. Lightning flashed faintly in the distance, followed by a low roll of thunder. The night had its rhythm again. Alma rested her hands over her belly, feeling the small kicks beneath. This was no longer the woman who had shivered on his porch, whispering apologies to the rain. The storm had changed her shape. James rose and fastened the door against the wind. She followed slowly, coat trailing behind her like a cloak. Inside, the cabin was as it always was, quiet, warm, waiting. She paused near the doorway and looked out one last time. The sky was split with light, the rain speaking the same language it had the night they met. But now she was no longer a stranger in the storm. James closed the door. The thunder rolled on. The world outside could gossip and whisper all it pleased. Inside these walls, something far quieter and far stronger was taking root. And though neither of them said the word, the air was thick with it. Something that sounded a lot like home.